Good afternoon. My name is Melton. I'm a senior attorney with the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm excited to be here today talking about our work to protect Tiehm's buckwheat. The center was founded in 1989, and we have approximately 200 staff now spread out across the country. We also have offices in Mexico. And the bottom statistics on this slide, although a little outdated, give you a rough idea of how we use the law to protect species in their habitat. And we've had a number of successes getting species listed as well as having their habitat protected. Moving to Nevada now, where the Tiehm's buckwheat is located. Nevada is a really interesting state because it's extremely arid. We have really isolated water sources, unique geological substrates, and microclimates. So it's really a perfect microcosm for where we find highly endemic species being present that are nowhere else in the country or maybe and most likely in the world. So that takes us to Tiehm's buckwheat. Tiehm's buckwheat is a single-site endemic. Its habitat is restricted to merely a small 10-acre area in the Rhyolite Ridge area of Nevada. And in 2019, a survey estimated there were about 43,000 plants scattered over 6 subpopulations. The species was discovered in 1984, so we're continuing to learn more about its life cycle and its needs. However, we do know it's restricted to highly mineralized soils with high boron content and lithium as well. So this map really shows how these 6 populations are kind of broken down, and we can see that it's in a pretty obscure area of Nevada with very little around. However, it is threatened, unfortunately, by a proposed open pit lithium mine. As this map shows, you can see the footprints of the different phases where it would wipe out the species and its habitat. Phase 1, wiping out 30% of the habitat, 60% of the individuals. Phase 2, wiping out over 80% of the species habitat and 90% of the individuals. In early 2019, we were tipped off by a BLM whistleblower that there were mineral exploration activities occurring in and near the species habitat. This staffer was particularly concerned about the impacts this could have on the species. So we got boots on the ground, and sure enough, unfortunately, there were impacts resulting from the exploration activities. So we decided to take action. And we did this by petitioning the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state of Nevada to extend protection to the species under the Endangered Species Act and under state law, respectively. We then also sued the Bureau of Land Management for authorizing those mineral exploration activities without fully complying with federal public land law. That lawsuit was then shortly thereafter settled, and the exploration plans were pulled. So that kind of takes us to, well, what can we do to protect the species? And that really is protection under the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is about recovering species from the brink of extinction. So it's not focusing on the mere survival of existing numbers, but recovering them, recovering the species. And this is recognized in the Act as having to go hand in hand with conserving the species habitat. And both listing species and designating their habitat are done based off of the best available science. The ESA listing process can be prompted by a public petition asking for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to add a species to the ESA. Once that petition is received, that kind of sets off a next stage in the process where the Fish and Wildlife Service has to make a 90-day finding on whether that position presents substantial scientific or commercial information indicating that an action may be warranted. If yes, then the Fish and Wildlife Service has 12 months to issue a 12-month finding of warranted, not warranted, warranted but precluded. Once that happens, you then have the Fish and Wildlife Service issuing a proposed rule in the instance that it finds listing is warranted. That proposed rule goes through notice and comment period. There's also review by peer review scientists And ideally, critical habitat is to be also getting designated concurrently with this listing process. The ESA listing process also provides kind of a stopgap measure. So when there's an emergency posing a significant risk to the well-being of any species of fish or wildlife or plants, the service can issue an emergency rule to extend ESA protections to the species. So it's not sitting in this limbo where it's being considered for ESA protection, but it doesn't quite yet have it. So this provides that protection while the Fish and Wildlife Service is moving forward with getting the species and its habitat on the listing. Our petition to list Tiehm's buckwheat focused on a number of different factors at play, ranging from kind of background on natural history of the species, population trends and forecasts, and then really honing in on 5 risks that we identified as being very concerning, warranting that listing action was needed. We also requested that critical habitat designation be made. One of the features we really focused on was the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. So there's multiple factors at play here. First is that the mining company Ioneer was really only doing voluntary measures during the exploration activities, and these were highly insufficient. For example, folks on the site that were doing these activities were completely unaware that there was this sensitive species located within kind of the footprint of the proposed exploration activities, that they were supposed to be taking measures to protect the species. There were other issues with kind of the management of the site. We were also really concerned that BLM was not kind of taking its duty to protect this sensitive species very seriously, and wasn't really upholding other aspects of the laws to help protect the species. At the same time, concerned too that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was maybe dragging its feet. We were going to deal with violations of statutory laws that would leave the species vulnerable as this proposed mine was starting to move forward. Another really concerning aspect of the proposed mine is that the mine's mitigation plan does not involve protecting the species where it's located, but focuses on transplanting the species and moving it out of its existing habitat. As you can see from this slide, one of the doctors that Ioneer had been working with raised significant concerns about the realities of this type of a mitigation approach because there are a lot of risks. It is experimental, it's not proven. And that has actually led to a significant amount of scientists coming out opposed to this mitigation plan, highlighting that no mitigation measures are acceptable or could lessen the impact to the species. We really need to be protecting the species where it's located, not trying to transplant it. In the fall of 2020, we unfortunately became aware of a significant destruction incident that had affected 40 to 60% of the buckwheats through removal, partial, or complete destruction. And this was widespread across all 6 subpopulations. We also saw a significant increase in foot traffic at the site. Although there's been some competing theories on whether this was caused by humans or rodents, independent scientists are concluding that it wasn't rodents that caused this destruction. This map here shows kind of our rough initial estimates, unfortunately, that we were projecting for the population impacts as a result of this large-scale destruction incident. As you can see, it's really significant and really takes those numbers of this species down drastically. This photo also shows kind of what we were seeing at the site, which is really these little craters left of where there used to have been buckwheats present. So that prompted us to take additional action. At the time, the Fish and Wildlife Service had continued to be dragging its feet to take those necessary next steps in the ESA listing process. And so we renewed our emergency petition to list, and we also then went into court. and went after the Fish and Wildlife Service for failing to protect and list the species in a timely manner. And we also went after BLM for failing to protect the species and prevent unnecessary and undue degradation of public lands. While the case was going on, we did also continue to unfortunately document ongoing harm to the species as a result of further impacts from OHV use and more social trails. Last spring, the court recognized that there was indeed well-founded concern for the species, and there was no dispute that we were dealing with a species that was undergoing a really steep decline. The court agreed with us that the Fish and Wildlife Service was in violation of the ESA. And as a result, we got court-mandated timelines for when the service needed to be taking its ESA actions. And this started with them issuing their long-delayed 12-month finding on whether or not to list. They did indeed find that listing was warranted, and we got a proposed listing rule in September, and we now have a proposed critical habitat rule that's out for public comment right now. We also petitioned BLM to nominate a number of acres around the buckwheat as an ACEC. This was actually proposed by BLM in 1998, but they never followed through. And BLM actually is undergoing some fencing project right now to keep OHVs on the road, which is a really good, encouraging development. As I noted earlier, we now have a comment period for the critical habitat rule. We are going to be asking for an increased 1 mile buffer, which is significantly more than what Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed. But at bottom, this is a really interesting case because we're going to see the power of the Endangered Species Act, the test of critical habitat and protecting native habitat, and BLM's obligations under public land laws to protect sensitive species. Thank you.